I got it.
Oh, you were okay.
So, good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO. It's such a delight to have Tom Enders here. Personal friend for many years, one of the finest Atlanticists I've known, one of the most visionary and creative and courageous industrialists I know. As many of you know, this evening, Tom will receive the Council's annual award for distinguished business leadership. This is something we give not just for business accomplishment, but also for the kind of person an individual is in the world, the kind of integrity, the kind of principles, the kind of focus they bring with them. And befitting that recognition, one can hardly think of a business leader better suited than Tom Enders to put a capstone on the extraordinary events here at the Council, both yesterday and today, marking both impressive progress but still daunting prospects toward a Europe whole and free. Tom, I must say, it's nice to be a somewhat lower security standard right now than the vice president who came before you. That was quite something. Your address will be the 6th event in the series we call the Atlantic Council Captains of Industry. The series aims to create a preeminent platform for the senior executives of business contributing to national security to address the public interests their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. We launched this series in October with an address by the Chief Executive of Excelis, David Melcher, and it's been followed by appearances from Linda Hudson, who was then still head of BAE Systems, Alan Lord, the CEO of Textron Systems, Dave Zollett, who leads the public sector business of Computer Science Corporation, and then earlier this month, a member like Tom of our International Advisory Board, General John Jumper, who delivered an insightful valedictory to his distinguished tenure as Chief Executive of Leidos. I want to salute Steve Grunman for launching this series. It's become one of the most popular series that we have now at the Atlantic Council. In a moment, the chairman of the Council's International Advisory Board, General Brent Scowcroft, will come to the podium to introduce Tom. But first, let me just very briefly summarize the particular impetus for this speaker series. First, there is a recognition that the business of defense is a vital thread in the fabric of our U.S. and allied national security and the national security across the alliance. Indeed, that realization is central to the establishment of the Council's M.A. and George Lund Fellowship. That position was made possible by a vice chairman of our Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security, George Lund. And as I said, that position is now headed by Steve Grunman. The second impetus for this series is the recognition that the, quote, vital thread of national security is being transformed. It's being transformed by the confluence of several contemporary changes in the landscape of this industry. Chief among those changes are, of course, the several manifestations of fiscal crisis, which is reducing national defense investments in nearly every capital of the West. In addition, there is the fact that while rapidly receding from more than a decade of counterinsurgency wars, Allied militaries now face novel challenges to securing peace and prosperity where it isn't altogether clear from year to year where one can best invest. Furthermore, advances in computing, sensing, communication, and biotechnology, just to name 4 of the new century's defining technologies, are further accelerating changes in the defense marketplace. Finally, defense industry investors are sounding new questions on how companies tethered solely to defense budgets will create value against the headwinds of slow growth and austerity. And of course, Airbus has made very clear how it's balancing now the challenges of defense spending by making the commercial side of its business larger and larger in proportion. With that, I want to invite to the stage Brent Scowcroft. General Scowcroft is the only person ever to have served as National Security Advisor to 2 different presidents. He served a 29-year career in the U.S. Air Force, which I always announce whenever someone's here who does things that involve flying. He was a 29-year career in the U.S. Air Force in assignments that included military assistant to President Richard Nixon and was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor. His contributions to the Atlantic Council are without parallel. We are literally here today because of General Scowcroft, and I never miss a chance to thank him for it in front of this sort of audience. But there is a new part to the Atlantic Council right now, which I have to say right now, General Scowcroft, and that is the hashtag for this event, and Tom will explain to you the hashtag, but the hashtag for this event is hashtag ACCOI, which stands for Atlantic Council Captains of Industry. And the event will be live tweeted from the Scowcroft Center new Twitter account at AC Scowcroft. And so you see your name is finding its way in all sorts of interesting places. So thank you, General Scowcroft, and thank you for coming here to introduce our featured speaker, Tom Enders.
Brad, for those typically generous words. For a moment, I thought I was going to be the speaker. Anyway, thank you and good afternoon to all of you. It is, for me, a great privilege and pleasure to introduce Tom Enders, Chief Executive of Airbus Group. To me, Tom is an Atlantic community entrepreneur. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Airbus, among its many triumphs, is one of the founding supporters of the Scowcroft Center for International Security of the Atlantic Council here today, and for which I am deeply grateful. The opportunity to hear from Tom is a fitting complement to the conference we just completed over the last 2 days. The sessions have tended to focus on the dimension of the transatlantic relationship involving international politics. Tom represents and can speak with authority to another vital dimension of that relationship, the ties of commerce, economics, and finance. The conference we just completed was a great triumph. As a matter of fact, I accused our CEO of staging the crisis in Ukraine to make sure the conference was a success. But exploring the dimensions of these 2 dimensions, that is public policy and business, is the aim of this series, the Atlantic Council Captains of Industry. The series is a platform to engage business leaders who are at the intersection of public policy and the business of aerospace and defense. Tom Enders, who will receive the Council's Distinguished Business Leadership Award this evening, exemplifies the captain of an industry. I screwed up, excuse me. Captain of industry in aerospace and defense. His 23-year career at Airbus and his predecessor companies, I'm sure you're all familiar with. CEO since 2012 and the head of its commercial aircraft unit since 2007, Tom's leadership has been instrumental to the normalization of the company's governance, restructuring of its portfolio, and the enhancement of its growth and profitability. Hence the entrepreneur title. His appointment 2 years ago to lead the entire corporation reflects his experience across the full breadth of the company's business units and multilateral locations. And on that point, let me mention that among the locations of this, quote, European, unquote, company is Mobile, Alabama, where Airbus will be assembling its A320 airliner beginning next year, a testament to the transatlantic relationships Tom has built for his company is the presence today of the former governor of Alabama, Bob Riley, whose participation in these events we very much appreciate. Less well known about Tom, perhaps, is that the first decade of his career was focused on academics, public policy, and military service. He was a paratrooper and attained the rank of major in the German Army Reserve. He worked as an assistant in the German Parliament and on the planning staff of the German Ministry of Defense. He even did graduate work at UCLA, earning a PhD in political science. Tom is also a past chairman of the Atlantic Bureau, an organization designed to promote German-American relations. He was instrumental to the establishment of Airbus's business in the United States, represented here today by its current CEO, Alan McCarter, and his predecessor, another essential friend of the Atlantic Council, Sean O'Keefe. The vibrancy of the Atlantic Council, indeed, of the transatlantic project as a whole, depends heavily on people like Tom Enders, who know how to operate effectively in business and in the public policy sphere. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tom Enders.
Thank you very much, Brent, for these flattering words. Thank you very much, Brent, for these very flattering words. I have to say I'm very honored, Fred, to speak here in this prestigious series today, Captains of Industry. I'm very happy, I'm very proud that we're partnering with the Atlantic Council since quite a few years with Scowcroft Center to be part of your International Advisory Board, and you've done a great job over years to really reinvigorate, revitalize the Atlantic Council and make it now one of the preeminent places for research, for discussion, not just in Washington. I think we've seen recently some rankings, but even worldwide. So great achievement to our friend Fred. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, lots of friends in this room, and I very, very much appreciate. You had a great conference before, you mentioned that, Europe Whole and Free. I think it was a roaring success. I didn't know, Brent, that he was instigating the unrest in Ukraine, but being such an able president and CEO, I wouldn't exclude that right from the start. I think Fred Kempe can do things like that. There was one thing I need to connect with, even though many of you were not here this morning, and that was when Nick Burns was saying this morning, I felt I should make a remark. We were tight on time and didn't do it. Says German businessmen are traveling to Moscow and embracing President President Putin. Well, I've counted 2 or 3 of my colleagues who've done that, so that there shouldn't be the impression that troves of German businessmen are traveling to Moscow to save their business and embrace the Russian president. And I have to say, I'm at least a little bit old-fashioned, but when it comes to international law, to the preservation of international law, the restoration, peace and security, I think that this has to have priority over business and over corporate profits. I just want to make that as a remark because I felt provoked this morning when Nick Burns made these remarks to add this to my presentation. Well, I changed the entire introduction here, so I hope my speechwriters are not too unhappy about it, but I felt under the impression of recent events and also my own experiences that I should do that. Before flying over yesterday, I was in Warsaw, in Poland on Monday, talking to government officials. And I have to say, I was very impressed by the mood, the seriousness of the government, the focus clearly being on enhancing collective security through NATO, through the EU, focus on enhancing the Polish defense posture. All that obviously against the backdrop of the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, or however you call it. And I found the conviction in Warsaw that Poland will become a frontline state of NATO, a frontline country with hostile or at least unstable neighbors in the East in the foreseeable future. And I think there's no doubt in Warsaw that Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance are facing the biggest political and security challenge in a generation or so. The re-emergence of a rather aggressive Russia on its borders, at least that's the perception in Poland and not only there. I read a comment by also a great friend, I think, of Atlantic Council, Thomas Ilves, President of Estonia, sometimes called the Estonian Cassandra, particularly when it comes to perception and judgment on Russia, I guess, in an interview with the FT, where he remarked that Russia's actions in Ukraine presented an, quote, existential issue, unquote, for the whole way of thinking about security in Europe in the past few decades. Now, it's not on me. I was working as an academic, as Brent mentioned, but that's a long time ago. It's not on me to analyze Russian policy or Ukrainian policy or the threat perceptions of the Polish and Baltic friends. But it strikes me when I look into the media these days that those people, so-called experts, particularly in Europe, who downplay the crisis, who practice equidistance to the quote-unquote conflicting parties, show even understanding for the events in Crimea and Ukraine, i.e. understanding for Moscow, are mostly the ones, and that I remember very well, who in the late 1980s were absolutely convinced that the Soviet Union was stable, even important for European peace, and that German reunification would never, ever happen. By the way, I was in Warsaw to discuss possibilities for further cooperation in the field of aerospace and defense, as you would imagine, and particularly to promote one of a very few truly transatlantic defense systems, a system developed by Lockheed and our European missile house, MBDA, under contract to which Airbus is a major shareholder, the contract from the US, the German, and the Italian government. I mention this not only because I'm very proud of what we have achieved. I think the world's best performing high-end air defense system, but because it quite naturally leads to the the question of transatlantic cooperation and how industry can perhaps better contribute to security, prosperity on both sides of the North Atlantic, and which political prerequisites have to be put in place. In industrial terms or in industrial language, how can we improve, how can we reinvigorate the supply chain? That's why we choose the title, The Supply Chain for Peace, Security, and Prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, as Fred mentioned, I'm leading a company that is predominantly in the commercial field. But my remarks today will be very much focused on defense. By the way, for the Q&A, we can change that. I'm obviously open also to discuss the commercial business. 80% in commercial business, most prominently, obviously, with our large commercial aircraft, the Airbuses. But the 20% defense business is important to us and to our defense customers, especially in Europe. And we are the #1 supplier in defense to the German, to the French and Spanish forces, and probably #2 and #3 in the UK. With roughly 14 billion euro revenue in defense, we own the largest defense business in Europe. And in the US, we are active on various fronts. It was already mentioned that we are currently building with good progress a large facility down in Mobile, Alabama, to start turning out great commercial aircraft next year. But we're soon delivering the 300th Lakota helicopter to the US Army on time, on budget. It's amazing what we can achieve in the US. That General Palomeros knows what I'm talking about. It's a big mystery to me why we are often unable to do the same in Europe. But in the US, we are obviously much better. We are supplying the Coast Guard since many years with helicopters, with fixed-wing, medium-light mission aircraft. We are supplying radars since many years to Lockheed Martin for the littoral combat ship. And we would have loved to supply tankers to the US Air Force, as Governor Riley and Ralph Crosby and Al know very well. We came that close, at least close enough for the US Air Force to tell us and everybody that indeed we had the best performing tanker aircraft there is in the world. But we will not give up on that one, Governor Riley. We're talking about supply chains. We buy, Alan, roughly $14 billion US dollars worth in the US year after year. Ladies and gentlemen, that's more than we buy in any other country in the world. We are the single largest customer outside the US of US aerospace products. But most of that obviously goes into the commercial aircraft, where we have, on average, I think, on our large commercial Airbus aircraft, roughly 40% US content. And that shows how interwoven these businesses are transatlantically. And sometimes people try to make you believe that it's black and white, it's Boeing against Airbus. If you look at the supply chain, you get a pretty mixed, very and thoroughly international picture. The transatlantic defense supply chain, however, is only a trickle of that. And will not surprise anybody. The reasons are well known: national sovereignty notions, tech transfer restrictions, but also industrial policy, employment, a lot of parochialism. But perhaps the biggest reason, the vastly different markets. In the US, we still have a budget all in all of roughly 600 billion US dollar. In the EU, it's around 190 billion euros. So clearly less than the half. If you look at the procurement numbers or the R&D or research and technology, we're talking about a difference of $74 not sure what number I have here, but I guess it's 2012 numbers or so. $74 billion in the US versus 4.8 billion euros in the EU. In a region with a gross domestic product higher than the US. Overall, I would say European defense is in an appalling state. There's been a lot of declarations, a lot of initiatives in the last 25 years, particularly after the end of the Cold War, but very little tangible, substantial action on the ground. Between 2001 and 2010, European defense budgets declined by 25 billion. And I think they are still shrinking as we speak, perhaps to the exception of Poland and the Baltic states, where the threat perception is now a different one. On average, we have 1.5% of a GDP we spend on defense in the European Union, 28 nations. I think in the US, General Palomeros, it's still over 4%. 2%, somebody mentioned that, I found in Secretary Gates' famous speech, UK, France, Greece, and Albania are above 2%. Everybody else is below. Some countries, NATO countries, are even at point something percent. And even the two leading military nations, the UK and France, and that was remarkable, I found at least, are unable to manage limited military operations, I'm talking about Libya, without massive US support. Europe has 17 production lines for tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, compared to 2 in the US. 16 naval frigates in Europe, different ones against a single class in the US. 89 active weapons program in the EU versus 27 in the US. These are 2009 numbers, and I think it has not gotten any better. By one account, 20% of all development costs in Europe are just for certification. Imagine that, because we have only national certification rules, 20%. We've seen some consolidation in the industry in areas like space, missiles, and electronics. Again, I'm not talking about commercial aircraft, but just defense. But there has been almost none in military aircraft, in ships, ground systems. Again, the answer to that why is quite clear. Too many national interests, too much overlap, and certainly too much waste. And European armament cooperation simply cannot compensate for such a fragmented political landscape. Secretary Gates in Brussels in June 2011, a lot of these people here, the audience will remember that, gave a pretty good, very blunt account of the European defense efficiencies in his so-called farewell address to Brussels, when he pointed out that the US share of NATO defense spending had risen to 75% against roughly 50% in the Cold War years. Pointed out that due to the European shortcomings, NATO faced the, quote, very real possibility of collective military irrelevance, unquote. Pointed out that if current trends, it's his words, if current trends in the decline of European defense capabilities are not halted or reversed, future US political leaders may not consider the return on America's investment in NATO is worth the cost, unquote. Well, ladies and gentlemen, very blunt words, but from a departing Secretary of Defense. And let me say, maybe these messages would make more of an impression with European governments if they were part of an inauguration address or something like that. But perhaps the events in Ukraine are more effective in holding the downward trend Gates was describing. As I said before, at least some East European countries have now voted to increase their defense spending to 2% and beyond. The European defense malaise, if I may say so in my undiplomatic style, has, of course, serious negative consequences for the industry. The obvious one is the procurement and R&D budgets are significantly smaller. Most of the investment is still spent on national programs. There's a lack of economy of scale, that's pretty obvious. If the US Air Force orders, what was it, 175 or 179 tankers in a first batch, Britain will order 14, factor of 10. That's probably most of the aircraft that get ordered. France is discussing an order in the same kind of magnitude, and then everything else you can forget. Less obvious is perhaps that even the big multinational programs, because the Europeans have years ago drawn the right consequences of the fact that this is a fragmented market, that this is not a single market like the US, and the consequence, the obvious one would say, we need to have multinational programs. We have to pool our defense needs. But even the big multinational programs are conducted very inefficiently. And that despite the fact that we have procurement agencies, a European procurement agency in Europe, OCCAR. But the nations hold OCCAR on a very short leash. If I say the nations, it's the national procurement directors who jealously watch over OCCAR, that OCCAR doesn't become really effective and does what it, at least I think in its statutes, was required to do. National work shares, national requirements, national certification, I mentioned that, national procurement rules, all this prevents scarce budgets being spent wisely and efficiently. I gather that these practices, ladies and gentlemen, have cost each, the European taxpayer, but also industry, in the last decade alone, billions and billions of euros. I sometimes wonder operating under such circumstances, why we are still able to manage a successful or a profitable defense business, but not, by far not as profitable, at least on average, as that of our American peers. These practices certainly do not result in what the Americans call a healthy industrial base. By the way, I've never heard that in Europe. Somebody speaking about a healthy industrial base, because that means an industry that should be allowed to make decent profits and should be incentivized to be in this field of business. Rather difficult notion in Europe. It will not have gone unnoticed on this side of the pond that we as a company, but also we as an industry, defense industry in Europe, are massively reducing capacities and workforce in Europe. So if you speak about the need to restructure and to revamp NATO as a defense alliance, work certainly has to start in Europe. I think that's the weak spot. And there, let me say, however, not everything is dark and hopeless. I don't want to conclude this European chapter on too gloomy a note. For instance, for the first time in 5 or 6 years, the European Council has held a defense summit last September. And this was not least thanks to President Barroso and President Van Rompuy's initiative. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of this defense summit. A lot of people have said lovely statements, little action, no integrated defense strategy. I'm here a little bit more optimistic. I think the glass is at least half full here. I mean, they have discussed concrete projects. They have already scheduled a follow-up meeting, but still, we are far, far away from an effective European defense strategy. Other positive examples, pooling. 9 EU countries plus Norway signed a letter of intent to pool their acquisition for tanker aircraft. France and the UK have done, not just recently, but over many years, have engaged in enhancing bilateral cooperation. And let me say very clearly, and not only because my friend General Palomeros is sitting here and Stefan Abrial in the audience, I sincerely believe that if Europe is really serious, will become serious about defense, it has to start with the two core nations. When it comes to defense and military postures, that's France and the UK. This is one reason why it's so important that the UK remains also in the European Union, not just in NATO. Another one positive example is the UK government. The current UK government has created a so-called UK Defence Growth Partnership, which is a very positive thing because a great example of government engaging with industry on a more strategic footing, letting us be the partner that we can be. And here I can say it's not just a nice label, Defence Growth Partnership. They put money where their mouth is. So this is undergirded by concrete budgets. And I think, again, this is something that's very positive. And last example, acquisition reform. I should say I applaud the work that Secretary Hagel, Secretary Kendall, and Congressman Thornberry are doing with the Better Buying Power 2.0 and other efforts to simplify the processes of the Department of Defense, removing barriers to entry, minimizing unique specifications using existing authorities instead of creating new ones, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, this should be a win-win for industry and for the government, and certainly a serious case that NATO should look to adapting that initiative. As a company, or as companies, we also try to do a lot. We try to be open to products that are initially developed for the commercial world, reducing the military requalification burden, open to architectures and say limited sovereign or national customization, allowing for easier and faster upgrades later on, and also open to reviewing legacy combat systems that might get in the way of a crucial goal of commonality. Now let me say a few words about trade. Of course, any conversation on defense or competition is incomplete if we don't mention trade. In fact, I don't think that the link between the economies and the security has ever been any stronger. Secretary Rasmussen has said many times that a healthy economy and sound security are part of a virtuous circle. And let me cut this short and say, look, this is why the TTIP is such an important initiative. The TTIP is about, well, everybody has his numbers, plus 400,000 jobs, so many billions of additional efforts, etc. But it must be clear to everybody in the defense community that particularly against the current background, the current backdrop, TTIP is a very strong contributor to our alliance and to reinvigorate and strengthen the alliance between Europe and the US. Some people have asked me whether I could imagine a TTIP for defense. Yes, I can do this, but not now. In some years. First, otherwise it would be completely unrealistic. The Europeans have to do their homework, and defense will certainly not be part of a current TTIP initiative. Let me, because I'm looking at the watch, I think Fred was looking at the watch, let me cut a few things here, but one thing I need to touch upon. So to say the final link in our supply chain, that's people, that's talent. I could not agree more with Linda Hudson from BAE North America that last year gave the captains of the industry a speech when she said that as an industry we must get much better at recruiting and retaining talent. She said we must be more inclusive, attractive, and inspirational. And she's right, and she's certainly not the first one to ring the alarm bells about growing risk on the industrial side, or what's being called the specter of the hollow force on the military side. The New York Times magazine summed it up well by asking, I quote, "Why do we smart, quantitatively trained engineers who could help cure cancer instead want to work for the latest social app?" Question mark, end of End of quote. What's important versus what's cool, that seems to be the choice here, but certainly a false choice. And if Linda thinks it's bad over here, ladies and gentlemen, it's much worse in Europe. I mean, how can we paint a positive picture of the future for young engineers to work in defense? On top comes the problem. We're working in defense industry in quite a few countries in Europe at least, and certainly including mine, is not something that has a good reputation. It comes with a good reputation. Many see it as kind of a dirty industry. Yes, we must do it, but kind of embarrassed about working in defense. That makes it very, very difficult to gain talent and to regain talent. As a large commercial company, when we look at all the capacity cuts that we are doing right now, I think we have a bit of an advantage. We can, for instance, at least for a while, hibernate military aeronautics skills inside the larger commercial box, but that certainly has a limit. We need also to think more about R&D programs, at least to the stage of demonstrators that produce something tangible for our people, for our engineers. Bright people don't want to work in this industry if all they do is doing some simulations on the computer screen, never do any hardware. This is not a new problem. I remember we discussed that already in the 90s, right after the Cold War. So now that we don't need these huge production lots anymore, we can ramp down our defense budgets. How do we keep a skilled workforce? How do we keep the skills and competence? And I think this is more topical than ever before. I come to the end. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the Atlantic community, a restructured, a healthy, a vibrant transatlantic alliance remains our best hope, our best asset for the future, a future that will not be void of challenges and threats, economical, political, military. I draw the conclusion that despite many disappointments and frustrations about each other, the NSA scandal, as we call it in Europe at least, I'm not sure you call it NSA scandal over here, but it's a very strong, very real problem in Europe, comes to mind when I speak about frustration. But that nevertheless, this is the time for more, not less, transatlantic cooperation. We have to strengthen the economic fundament of our alliance. And this is where TTIP can make a very huge difference, as well as its security and defense posture. I think we are reminded these days that military power continues to play an essential role in international relations, like it or not. Diplomacy, soft power, speaking softly, can achieve only that much if it's not backed up by credible military options. It's a big stick that I think Theodore Roosevelt was talking about. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. We at the aerospace industry today, we contribute a lot. I include the commercial, to global mobility, connectivity, to prosperity. And let me say, we stand ready to contribute to our nation's security, hopefully more effectively, hopefully more efficiently. And ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to do so. Thank you very much for your attention. The hot chair.
These are the new chairs, Tom.
Yeah. The hot chair.
The hot chair. That was really a lot of that. You honored the quality of this audience with the quality of that address. So thank you so much. There are a lot of experts in this audience, so I think I'd rather turn to them more quickly this time around. So I'm going to just ask one question and then turn to the audience and maybe intersperse a little bit. You spent a lot of time on TTIP. So I wonder, I get the feeling even at a time when you would imagine that Ukraine would make it all the more urgent to do something of this nature for strategic reasons and global reasons, that it's losing some steam. And particularly in Germany, I get the feeling in my latest trip in Germany that because of the NSA business and other things, that it's lost some steam. We also have problems in the United States with the Trade Promotion Authority and Trans-Pacific Partnership in front of it. What's your reading of the situation with TTIP in Europe? Does it face dangers, and just how bad would it be? It'd be great if it came along, but how bad would it be if it doesn't?
Well, Fred, I'm certainly not a TTIP expert here, and I would say that my observation is that the opposition to TTIP is at least as strong in France and the UK than it is in Germany. But it boils down to what was discussed in one of the panels this morning. It boils down to leadership. And right now I perceive the major governments in Europe a little bit oscillating between taking a strongly positive stance and letting things drift, which I think is very dangerous. And the other thing is that that's criticizing a little bit my own community, that I think the business community has not yet done enough to position itself very clearly. With that, I don't mean just the large associations that come with their standard kind of boilerplate, good arguments, etc. I'm not sure that is really convincing. I think this needs to spread also to companies, not just associations, to companies, also to smaller companies, to the entire supply chain, to make people aware what is at stake. And particularly in Germany, we have benefited so much from globalization, transatlantic trade, of course, that the fear is largely irrational. But if there's no strong leadership from politicians and from the business community, we might indeed see that there's more opposition to come. I think likewise here probably in the United States, if there's no strong leadership pro TTIP, the negative forces might prevail. And what is at stake is that we would not exploit a huge potential for additional growth, for additional employment, for additional GDP, and would also lose the opportunity to set standards, perhaps for the rest of the world. I wouldn't overemphasize that point, but if we leave the leadership to others, I mean, a lot has been said this morning about this great, Vice President Biden was talking about this great achievement, the Atlantic Alliance. Why would the Atlantic Alliance let such a possibility go? But the situation is fragile, is volatile in the publics, and leadership is required.
Have you calculated for your own company? I know you said that you didn't expect a defense TTIP, but for the 80% of your company that's commercial, have you calculated what it would do? What help it would give?
I think in our specific case, it doesn't have much of an impact because let's face it, we have a lot of harmonization already transatlantically. I mean, if I talk about certification, the FAA, the European counterpart, the EASA, are already cooperating very much on the same standards and the same certification procedures, etc. If one certifies an aircraft, the other certifies it as well. There's been huge progress, so all these kind of things. But I think in the overall context for us will be very positive. I cannot put a tag in that and say we will sell that many more 100 aircraft, etc. But it's certainly good for the European, for the North American markets, and particularly our commercial business follows the economic development and growth very, very closely.
So Steve Grumman wouldn't forgive me if I didn't ask one question that we've asked, I think, almost everyone who's been a participant in this speaker series. The difficulty defense executives are having is where to place bets and where to take risk. And at one end on the spectrum, we've heard defense executives saying that they've got to wait for the military customer to say what's needed and what's necessary. At the other end, we heard from Ellen Lord of Textron Systems that successful companies have to get ahead of a defined customer need. Where do you stand on that?
I certainly go with a second opinion. I think it's particularly on large companies to try to not manipulate, but influence, lead certain requirements on the military side. I mean, Ralph and I have a couple of wonderful examples. When Ralph was at Northrop Grumman, and I was still at Daimler Aerospace. We thought about some of the things that would make a lot of sense, would meet the requirements. There were some basic requirements. We're talking about introducing the Global Hawk into Europe, talking about NATO AGS. We were just discussing it over the table. We were not terribly successful here. The Eurohawk story in Germany was not with a happy ending, and AGS is not what we thought it should be 10 years ago or 12 years ago. It's just one example, because we said, look, we shouldn't wait for governments to address us. We read their requirements. We can understand that. We should come with suggestions. I think this is what big companies should do. But there's a fine line here to take between being accused of manipulating requirements, etc., and being proactive with the military customer.
Thank you. Good answer. Questions? Please.
Thank you. I'm Walter Statler. My background is foreign service, and before that military, and I've had tours multiple times in Germany as well. I've been associated with the National Defense University for the last 20 years. I was very pleased to hear about collaboration on the military side, and that's a very good example. The problem, in a way, is that that particular sector does not attract the attention, really, of a large general public and to those who should be paying attention to that. So my question is really, what about joint ventures on the commercial side? I mean, this is aside from componentry and whatnot between large companies, and the obvious example, of course, would be Boeing and your company. Has any thought been given to that, and have you been doing any of that at all? In other words, projects that are large enough to attract the attention of governments and, more importantly, politicians. And
the last time I tried to attract the attention of politicians, that went awfully wrong. That was when we tried the merger with BAE Systems, but that was on defense. No, but we have not given any thought to joint venture between Boeing and Airbus, simply because it's completely unrealistic. I mean, I don't think our customers would appreciate that to start with, nor the regulatory authorities, because over a large spectrum of our portfolio, we have a duopoly today. I mean, the Chinese may come in a couple of years, the Brazilians, the Canadians are in the lower segment, 100-seaters, etc. But this is completely unrealistic. But I think in the years ahead, we might see some consolidation. Difficult to predict how it pans out between the larger and smaller manufacturers, but certainly not between the two big elephants. And I think Governor Riley would violently object to that anyway.
Yeah, please, yes, here and then in front.
Sure, Byron Cowan, Capital Alpha. Can you talk a little bit about the European requirements, and if the budgets do turn, what do you think are the most pressing defense needs in Europe right now? Is it transport, mobility, munitions? Where are the opportunities going to be if this does change?
The opportunities in Europe, what are the biggest opportunities in Europe in the defense side?
In the defense side, in the defense.
And do you believe, let me add something to that, do you believe they've changed in the face of Ukraine? Are there some shifting winds at all that you're already noticing or not?
Well, I believe that the defense summit in December, which I mentioned, basically got it right. I mean, they put the finger on some of the glaring deficiencies, like unmanned aerial systems, like strategic surveillance and reconnaissance, strategic communication. Wasn't on the list, but if we go to Libya, one of the things is obviously also smart munitions. I mean, if you have a low-intensity campaign and you run out of smart munitions after a couple of days, that is certainly not something that encourages you to think that the Europeans could do limited operations, at least, in the future.
Please. Yes.
My name is Martin Apple. I'm a scientist. So I want to look at a hypothetical game. The game is a table full of McDonald's burgers. McDonald's burgers. And so you walk by on one side of the table, I walk by on the other. And every time you walk by, you take one. and I'm on the other side, and the only thing I can defend that against is I got the biggest sledgehammer in the world, but I'm not willing to deploy it for taking one hamburger. How many hamburgers can you get away with before I finally deploy? And that's really the question we're facing in general, isn't it?
Sorry?
This is a good crane analogy. Cranes can take off the table before it deploys his sledgehammer.
I'm not the expert to.
But
Fred,
let me move from McDonald's to a related question, which was the other one, which is what do you feel the impact has been thus far of a more predatory Russia in Europe? Are you seeing differentiated moods?
Yeah.
And does this animate a conversation that will allow you to take on, or allow politicians and industry to take on some of the issues you're talking about in terms of changing the way things are done in Europe?
Well, again, I don't feel I'm the right man to answer that in the presence of General Palomeros, General Wald, and General Abriel, and others here. I don't know, but my sense is that the requirement side of the North Atlantic Alliance is going to be discussed in much more seriousness now than it has been in the past. And one would hope that the decision makers, not just the national ones, but also the ones that are heading NATO, are using the opportunity to come back to these glaring deficiencies and encourage the various actors, and not just the Eastern Europeans, because the Eastern Europeans obviously get it. I was amazed to see that some of them had also point something percentage on GDP. So I think this is going to change. I think one of the, if I may slightly deviate, one of the big challenges for America will be, and I think somebody mentioned this morning, that you don't put too much strain in the alliance. I mean, America and the East Europeans versus the Western and Southern Europeans who, quote unquote, just don't get it. That I think could be a problem. But then again, I hope that there's also a serious intra-EU discussion about it. And by the way, let me say one thing, because I heard that recently. Somebody said, forget all this EU nonsense. We should focus and concentrate everything on NATO. I think that would be an absolutely wrong approach. The Europeans have progressed with lots of problems and challenges still, but nevertheless, in terms of integration, that far, that NATO, strengthening NATO and strengthening the EU, for me, is one thing. And I think it's in the long-term strategic interest of the United States to strengthen a EU, let me call it defense caucus, whatever it is, and more than that. We are still many, many years away from having a European defense minister or something like that, and hopefully not that many years away from having a functioning, empowered procurement organization. OCCAR is in place, but as I said, it's kept on a short leash. So if the US is really interested long-term in a strong partner, we should also very much support the EU activities in organizing a more powerful defense in Europe.
Thank you very much. Questions, please.
Hi, Michael Bruno with Aviation Week and Space Technology. How do you view America in regards to business expansion potential? Is it a place to look for mergers and acquisition? Or is it simply just a place to try to get in on some Pentagon programs? How do you look at it for the next few years for Airbus?
Anything you'd like to announce here is...
Sure. It's always good to have it first in Aviation Week and Space Technology, that's for sure. Well, look, I mean, we're here because this is simply a market too large to ignore. The US still sets the standards on the commercial side, and certainly on the military and space side. I would say, Ralph and Alan and Jean, after so many years, we have been successful. I mentioned all the things that we are bringing to the US warfighter, to the Coast Guard, etc. We have very competitive activities in helicopters. We have very competitive activities in large fixed-wing aircraft, derivatives of the commercial aircraft, the Airbuses. We have very competitive activities in space, on launches, on satellites, in missiles. I mentioned at the outset MBDA. That, I think, is the second largest, at least, missile activity in the world. And miraculously, it even works well as a joint venture, even though I have to say I'm not necessarily a big fan of joint ventures or new joint ventures, and certainly not exclude activities or the acquisition of businesses or companies over here. The right one comes away at the right time, but that is not the main focus. I mean, we're building on the businesses that we have. And we are selling many more helicopters, right, than these 300 that we will celebrate in a week's time or so. So I'm very happy with the US business we have. And let's not forget, we're building a huge footprint in commercial in Alabama. And that is because the US is the premier market in single-aisle aircraft. And from then we will see how we will proceed. So we will proceed on two or three prongs, in commercial and in defense and space, as well as on helicopters, which is typically dual use for commercial and for defense.
So doing my colleague's bidding for him, you're not confirming or denying that you're looking for acquisitions?
You summarized it well, Fred.
Questions? Please.
Tom, can you talk a little bit about, thanks for this, can you talk a little bit about China and how you see that growing as far as either you being a competitor or partner with the Chinese in building, mainly commercial?
Thank you very much. Yeah, General Ward, yeah, that's a very pertinent question. Certainly, we anticipate that the Chinese will build large commercial aircraft in the future. They've just, after many years of delays, they've just gotten off the ramp their regional aircraft, kind of a 100-seater, I guess, or 90-seater. They are currently developing an aircraft that goes head-to-head against the 737 and our 320 family. So it's only a matter of time. It's not a question of when. You would think that a nation that brings men into space and back, that's a real challenge in space, as we know. In manned space, will also be able to build great commercial aircraft. We're preparing ourselves for that by developing an industrial footprint in China, by assembling, delivering large aircraft out of China, out of Tianjin, very successfully, I should say. We have a lot of partners in China, in our supply chain, etc. But we see them coming as a competitor. Our goal here is that even if they have established a formidable commercial aircraft competitor there, that they should still be interested in not just a monopolist situation. It's a bet, kind of. But I think that's the best we can do right now, like many other companies in other branches of the industry. Defense is something to watch. I think it got our attention when the Turkish decided to procure a Chinese air defense system. Wow. I mean, okay, there may have been other intentions than just the performance of that. But that is something to watch. They are developing very sophisticated UAVs and stuff like that. So I think the Chinese will become very quickly a serious competitor internationally also in defense. I mean, we've been talking many years about can we at some point export defense products into China? Can we cooperate with them? Well, that is closed. I think that discussion is gone. The discussion is more how far will China be a serious competitor in our quote-unquote Western markets and in Asia, Pacific, in other parts of the world.
If you were to predict when there will be a Chinese Airbus Boeing, so it doesn't become a duopoly, it becomes whatever the three part of this is, how far off is that?
I hope many years.
Sherry Goodman.
Thank you. Sherry Goodman, Center for Naval Analysis. Continuing a Europe that's whole and free likely depends on a more strategic approach to energy and energy security than we've had to undertake in the past. What role do you see for industry your industry in particular, in the emerging debate within Europe about changing the equation of energy security, energy independence, developing more alternatives to dependence on Russian oil and gas, and also better to interconnect within Europe transmission of various types of energy?
Well, they are certainly not at the forefront of that. I mean, we are an aerospace company, and I want to stay an aerospace company. No plans to venture into the energy sector. But let me say, the initiative that I think has been largely formulated by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has not been created by everybody so far in Europe.
The European Energy Union, right?
The European Energy Union, I think, is a right idea. However, it gets operationalized, and Vice President Biden was speaking about that just before lunch as well. But it'll take a while because we have a lot of different vested interests in Europe. Not everybody is immediately enthusiastic about it. We are doing for our small perimeter, we have a lot of work going on for alternative propulsion of aircraft. I mean, there's a famous saying that the last drop of fossil fuel that will be burned on this planet will be burned in an engine of an aircraft, right? That may well be because we are particularly dependent in aeronautics on fossil fuel today. But since quite a few years, we, but also our competitors, of course, the engine makers have a lot of research going on and demonstrations on alternative fuels. We just created some headlines last week when we flew completely electrically, but I have to admit that was not a 100-seater, that was a one-seater. Then we'll have a two-seater, a four-seater, not a problem. We think we can scale it up to a regional aircraft in the next 20 years. With close cooperation with companies like Siemens, GEs, and Safran, and the engine makers. So I think the aeronautic industry is doing what it can to reduce the dependence on fossil fuel for aeronautic propulsion right now.
Please, thank you. Yes.
Peter Flory with Kinetic North America. Before that, at NATO and responsible for the NATO AGS program, which you mentioned earlier, which I think, on balance, is a relative success story, but not all that we might have hoped that it would be. And what I wanted to ask you is, from an industrial perspective, and you have a good sense of what the challenges are from NATO AGS, from MEADS, from a number of other programs. At the end of the day, these programs typically have a lot of political support, but are very hard to actually put into practice. I mean, ultimately, what are the elements that you think would make for a successful program along these lines? And I guess maybe it should have been the first question. At the end of the day, from an industrial perspective, are programs like this, is the game really worth the candle?
Well, let me be frank with you. And I briefly touched on the issues with multinational programs. I mean, for most of the players in the industry, multinational programs have become a horror because they are very, very difficult to manage. They're difficult to manage on the industrial side. They are difficult to manage on the political side. There are some positive examples, and this is when there's one lead on the customer side rather than a concert of customers or new agencies that are created for horror, and one lead on the industrial side, so that one company leads and has subcontractors and has at least a significant degree on freedom to select the right contributors, the right suppliers. all the catastrophes we have seen, to put it very bluntly, or the diplomatically, the difficult programs in the last 10 or 20 years, and talking about A400M, talking about the NH90 helicopter. NH90 helicopter, we have more versions than we have national customers. Imagine how efficient that can be and how much money you can make out of something. A400M, it's no secret that the industry would have preferred the one supplier that was known to be knowledgeable about large turboprop engines, Pratt & Whitney, Canada. We conceded to a European consortium that had never worked together on that stuff. That tried to develop that engine by committee, I should say, up to a certain crisis point when this was changed. That has cost taxpayers billions. That has cost industry billions. I have to say, after that many years in the industry, I'm determined, at least for my company, not to ever again walk into such a program consciously, and rather resist contracting and say, no, we're not doing there. And industry has made this mistake time and again. We said, oh, we know the budget is not sufficient, the timeline is too short, but let's have order intake first. There's a window of opportunity. My goodness, 5 nations or more are for once on the same requirement line, etc. Let's grab the order, and we'll figure it out in 5 or 7 years. That hardly ever works. At the end, again, industry has a lot of egg in the face. We're losing lots of money, and that should not happen again. I mean, we are trying as industry, and we particularly on all levels to discuss that with our customers. If future programs should be set up, General Palmero's thinking about the famous never-ending story on UAVs in Europe, for instance, but we do it the right way, but we're not repeating the many mistakes we've made in the past. But also, I mean, curriculum in the United States, MIAT is a good example. We have developed together since 2004, I think all in all more than 4 billion, was it US dollar probably. The Germans, the Italians, the Americans, a great air defense system, really high-end, 360-degree capability. The only system on the planet that can battle and shoot down missiles that come from completely different trajectories, one from the front, one from behind, and they've proven that. And the US walks out of it. And now we're trying as industry to make the best out of it with our partner Lockheed Martin, trying to convince the Germans, the Italians to stay with the system. As I mentioned, the Poles as well, and probably others. So many programs are lacking in consistency over time. That makes it also very, very difficult. But in general, industry should have much more say on how we do the programs. The requirements are the militaries, or maybe defined by the military or whoever. But the execution should be, the authority for execution should be much more on the industrial side. So far, all we have reached at best is a kind of half-half situation, and that almost always ends in disappointment, put it mildly.
Thank you, Tom. I have time for a last question, and I'm going to piggyback on that with a quick one as well, please.
Thanks, Tom, for the presentation. I'm Nikolai Vorobyov. I'm Ukrainian journalist, just recently came to DC. So I have actually plenty of questions, and just I will ask two short. And first is about the sanctions which were put on Russia. So how it impact on your business. Second, did you have any negotiations with Ukrainian side after the revolution? And what are the main challenges for you having cooperating with like Eurasian region, except like corruption, monopolies, and the same. So I just want to emphasize that it's really difficult for Ukrainian people to travel. So I have to pay much more to get to Germany for right now than even to the United States. That's why. So it's because of monopoly, and they don't let you to come to their markets. So can you explain? The first is about sanctions, and the second, cooperation with Ukraine. Thanks.
Well, the first about sanctions, how we impact it. I mean, that I should say remains to be seen. Depends on how this crisis develops. But we have, and that's no secret, we have a business with the Russians on titanium, i.e. we have supply of a huge part of our titanium that comes from, from Russia. Titanium is a very essential material on building aircraft, even in a time when carbon fiber is more and more used on the structures. We are not the only one aeronautic company that has a huge business with the Russians on titanium. So far, no sign that this should run into a problem, but you can imagine scenarios where this could become a problem. I think we're realizing all these days in industry and elsewhere, this is not the year 1990. There was literally no business at all with the Eastern world, with Russia. Over the last 25 years, we have developed a lot of business with Russia, with former parts of the Soviet Union. Obviously, there's a strong, I should say, mutual dependency, and this is why this sanction business is not clear cut. Who's going to win and who's going to lose? Besides the fact that I think that the current sanctions are worse than no sanctions, but that's a different story. I mean, in a sense, to convince the Russian leadership of stopping their moves, because you can easily sit in Moscow and don't find that very serious or even ridiculous of what the West is leveraging on you. Ukraine, well, I hope that we can do business with Ukraine in the future. So far, there is no business really, but that will very much depend on the development there, whether we are dealing with a stable Ukraine or not, and that not just goes for our company or for aerospace company, that goes for a lot of industries.
We're out of time, but I like to close very often with someone of your stature, global CEO with the businesses you have sprawling across the globe, with a question that might require a long answer, but encourage you to give a short one, which is the best CEOs in the world know how to seize opportunities and know how to manage risk. What is the biggest opportunity, very briefly, that you're seeing in your business with Airbus? What is the biggest risk you feel you have to manage right now that worries you, keeps you up at night?
Well, the biggest opportunity is certainly that with 80% of our business, we're operating in a still growing market. The commercial aircraft market, I mean, we're not at the end of the line here. We're talking about Europe and US is a pretty saturated market. You have replacement waves, currently in such a wave here in the US, certainly. But in other parts of the world, particularly Asia Pacific, there's still a strong growth trend. Well, you see airlines going up and down, but over the next 20 years, we're pretty confident. We're pretty bullish, all of us in aerospace, that this will continue. But this is at the same time the biggest risk. At the same time, the biggest risk. The biggest backlog, the largest backlog we have today on the commercial side is in Asia Pacific. And it's growing. So, I mean, we are all focusing right now on Ukraine. Before, the focus was much more on Syria, but particularly also on the Japanese skirmishes and what's developing in this area. And we can only hope that at least on that quote-unquote front, things stay quiet, because that would have a tremendous negative impact on a lot of business, on almost all businesses in the Western world who are deeply in the Chinese market.
Fascinating. Tom, let me just say a couple of things in closing. First of all, thank you for what in the diplomatic businesses would be called a full and frank conversation across a wide range of top topics. I think there's just a lot to chew on here. It'll be on the site. You'll be able to look at this, anything that you've missed. Second of all, I want to declare at this point our Toward a Europe Whole and Free conference closed. We were delighted to add this special feature to it. I think that everyone got a lot out of it. And thanks to you who came for this feature, and thanks to you who have been here throughout the last 2 days. And Tom, we look forward to honoring you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. My goodness, I didn't know yet.